Hi everyone, how are you? Just saw you this morning. It is the afternoon of September 4th, Friday. We talked this morning about William Cullen Bryant and Washington Irving. As I told you this morning, what I'm going to do is post these short videos, and that way you guys will have sort of a less rushed fleshing out of some of the ideas that we'll talk about when we're reading our texts together. I just feel as though in the 50-minute time period that we have, I just can't get things to you that I want to, and I feel like I'm rushing. So hopefully this will help me slow things down when we're meeting in Zoom. So I'll tell you largely things that I've already told you, either this morning or when we last met on Wednesday, with some additional material as well. Anything that I talk about here, you can shoot me an email and ask me about. We can talk about in class when I see you next week, Wednesday. But hopefully this will be useful for you and help you absorb the material a little bit more easily than if I'm, talking at you in the Zoom format, which we're all kind of adjusting to. So, what I want to talk with you about today is a little bit more background on the cultural climate when Irving and Bryant are writing. And then I want to just talk a little bit more about Romanticism and sort of restate some of the ideas that we've been talking about in our last two meetings. So, there's a bit of a flowering in the arts in what becomes the United States for part of that time, what is the United States, between 1763 and 1790. And there are very high hopes for what American culture is going to look like. People believed, European Americans, Americans of European and Anglo descent, believe that one of the hallmarks of a really flourishing culture is a really lively, vibrant art scene, despite all their anxieties about the arts, which I'll talk about another time. So there are a lot of calls for this native, and by native I don't mean Native American, but homegrown, nationalistic, sort of singing the praises of America culture. And people continue to call for this, but the popular perception, the perception among the reading public, was that we're really largely failing in that regard, that we don't really have any national literature, nobody pays any attention to American culture, that we're sort of savages in the wilderness, no matter what your race is in this country. The writers seem to be kind of stuck between really highly imitative of British forms and this not yet born American style of letters. It's stuck, is the popular perception. Of course, there are things being produced during this time, during the first 2 decades of the 19th century, and the last few years of the 18th. Susanna Rowson is a woman writer who publishes Charlotte Temple, very popular sentimental novel. Those of you who had me in 309 last semester read Hannah Webster Foster's The Coquette. That's published in 1797. And this other novel is published by a guy named Hugh Henry Brackenridge. It's called Modern Chivalry. That's published in 1792. Really, about 100 novels were written between 1789 and 1820. So people are writing stuff. And there are poets, most notably Philip Freneau. Again, those of you who took 309 with me know who Philip Freneau was. These folks are publishing. But this sense of excitement around an American literature, which was really powerful during the years of the Revolution, right around the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, is really it's just kind of fizzled out. There's a sense that we just haven't gotten there. It's a kind of national letdown. Irving is really responding to this sense of pessimism and sadness and disappointment. So in the years from about the end of the War of 1812 right up until sort of the rumblings of the Civil War, there's a lot of worry about this sense that this rapidly developing nation is going to lose the spirit of the Patriot Age, the spirit of revolution, that there's too much change, that there's no sense of continuity, there's nothing unifying us. Sound familiar? Sounds a little bit like the way people are feeling right now in our own time. So Irving responds to that sort of sense of disappointment about American culture and this sense that things are changing too rapidly, that there is no American culture. Irving responds to that with this sort of warm, genial, accessible, enjoyable prose. Washington Irving, for example, in the Sketchbook, which is published in 1820. So we see that persona in the author's account of himself, which we didn't talk about today, but I'll try to get to next week. But that's Irving's shtick. That's sort of what he's up to. He wants to write these, he calls them sketches, these short stories that are accessible and that create a sense of American past and American culture. Okay? So that's what Washington Irving is up to. And it's cool. No one else has really done that. He's kind of the only guy to really do that. He's the first. There's more to say about Washington Irving, but we'll leave that there for now. So, Washington Irving, cultural situation. Let's just step back a little bit now and talk specifically about Romanticism. And I did tell you about some of this last week, and I reiterated it, not last week, excuse me. Sorry, guys, all days are blurring together right now. On Wednesday, and I reiterated some of it in class today. But I just want to make sure that you have a handle on Romanticism and the Romantic period in the United States, which is a little bit different than what's happening in Britain. Some of you may have had Professor Adams and know something about Romanticism, and hopefully we can talk about what you know in class on Wednesday. So, as I mentioned to you last time, this period, the antebellum, the pre-Civil War period in American literature, is known still. It was given this name by the American critic F.O. Matheson as the American Renaissance, this sort of flowering of American culture. And as I mentioned to you last time, one of the things that is important about this period, and as I just talked about a minute ago, is this call for American literary nationalism and American literature, distinctly American literature, separate from European and British literary traditions. The other thing that's really powerful during this time is this growing idea of the American individual, American individualism. That is not something that's always been with us. Those of you who've studied earlier American literatures know that the Puritans, for example, were a very tribal and a very communal culture, at the same time that they saw the individual as having an independent relationship to God. They were very much about community and sticking together in the face of the other, whoever that might be, either the non-Puritan or Native Americans or anyone who they didn't recognize as Christian and quote-unquote civilized. So very, very kind of tribal in nature. But this rising idea of the American individual, and we're going to be talking about this all semester, really starts to come into its own in the early part of the 18th century. I'm not going to talk about that now. I will talk about that another day. So, rise in calls or continuing and louder calls for an American national literature, and the importance of this idea of the American individual, the rugged individualist. Some other cultural things that were going on, which I've talked with you about already, the booming economy, the new ways to transport goods, among them books, westward through the railroad, through canal system. There is no copyright in the United States until really the 1890s, until 1891. There is an international, excuse me, guys, there is an American copyright, but no international copyright law until 1891. And so you've got to pay an American writer if you're publishing his works in this country, but you don't need to pay a British or European writer. And so what that means is that publishers want to publish works not written by Americans because they don't have to pay them. If they've got an American writer, you've got to pay him. So kind of weirdly, what that means is that British books, European books, are really popular, and American books don't get as much airtime. And I talked to you a little bit about Washington Irving's manipulation of that oddity in securing a British copyright. I'll return to that when I see you in class next week. So the economy is booming. The book market is changing. There is an American copyright law, but no international copyright law. All these things have an influence on what people are reading, how much they can read. The population is growing. America before the American Civil War is really dynamic and changing. Reform movements, temperance, anti-slavery, abolition, not the same thing. We'll talk more about that later on. Women's suffrage, the fight for women to get the vote. All these things are happening at the time. It's an exciting time in American literature and culture. And of course, Romanticism. Romanticism is sort of the umbrella movement under which we find Transcendentalism and the Gothic, in the rise of the novel in this country too, but right now we're just going to focus on Romanticism, which is the most important literary movement of the early 19th century. As we discussed today, that grows partly out of the Industrial Revolution. People are feeling romantic for the natural world. Romanticism glorifies the natural world, among other things. And it's also a response to the relatively cerebral, intellectual Enlightenment movement of the 18th century. So Romanticism is pushing against that emphasis on logic and reason, which is part of the Enlightenment. Romanticism appeals to the imagination. It revels in the power of the imagination. It stresses emotion rather than reason. It is optimistic, usually. When we get to dark Romanticism, with folks like Poe, it's much more dark and less optimistic. And it is subjective in form and in meaning, as we discussed today when we looked at the form of William Cullen Bryant's poems. So it form depends on meaning rather than using already existing forms for all different kinds of literature, all different kinds of emotional texts. Okay? So some techniques, some characteristics of Romantic literature. Romantic texts are often set in remote places and spaces and times. The plot in Romantic works is really improbable. Guy drinks some gin and falls asleep for 20 years, for example. Characters are not really fully fleshed out. Think about Dame Van Winkle. She's kind of a cardboard cutout of a nasty, scolding wife. Again, as I was just saying, form is organic. It grows out of whatever it is the author wants to say rather than the author using already existing forms. So there's a lot of experimentation in form. And there's a cultivation of an individualized or subjective form of writing, trying to do new things that reflect the individual's experience of the world. Okay, that feels like a lot, so I'm gonna shut her down now. There's more to say about Romanticism, but in William Cullen Bryant and in Washington Irving, those two guys signal the beginning of the Romantic movement in this country. That's sort of they're markers for us. All right, hope you've enjoyed this. Hope it's useful for you. Let's talk about any questions you have about anything that I've said. Email me. Let me know any questions that you have. I hope you all have a lovely weekend. It's a gorgeous day. Can't wait to get outside. And I will see you next week, Wednesday. Take care, everyone. See ya. Bye.